Groups of people descended on abandoned stores, almost as if they'd been planning it all along, carrying out whatever they could. By midnight, the National Guard patrolled the streets with the order, shoot to kill. Rhode Island remained under martial law for weeks following the hurricane, and it would be 2 weeks before traffic returned to normal in downtown Providence, as well as businesses reopening. So by 5 p.m., storm surges and powerful winds were hitting the Massachusetts shore, from Horseneck Beach to Buzzards Bay. Horseneck Beach had 30-foot-high waves. That beach was swept completely clean. 23 people died in Westport. So here is a neighborhood in East Beach before the hurricane. Here is that same area, same angle after. Not a building remained. People living in this area were trapped by the incoming sea on one side and marshes on the other. Factories shut down in New Bedford. About 1,000 people in Fairhaven became homeless. At least 7 people died. Out of 170 houses on Crescent Beach and Mattapoisett, only 10 would survive the storm's fury. 41 people in the greater Fall River area lost their lives. Poorly built fishing villages were destroyed. Yacht clubs were picked off their foundations and sailed away, and boardwalks were smashed to bits. Throughout southern New England coastal towns, waterfronts would never be the same. Under the Sagamore Bridge, 3 elderly women, a mother and her 11-year-old son, were trapped on the 2nd floor of this house, the same house you can see here, and they actually ended up drowning. Rescue workers had to cut a hole in the roof to retrieve the body, and this house was originally located 2 miles south of where it eventually ended up. Now, the Lower Cape was not close to the storm's eye. That and the islands diminishing the hurricane's power helped spare it from mass destruction. The Cape Cod Canal also helped save much of the Massachusetts coast. When storm surges rose up to 16 feet, the canal provided an outlet for all of that water. Boston's main problem also began around 5 p.m., and it was mostly with winds. Old Ironsides broke from its anchorage and took a pounding. Displayed windows along Boylston and Tremont streets broke. The Arnold Arboretum lost 1,500 trees. Boston Public Garden and Harvard Yard lost trees that had existed for centuries. Boston City Hospital treated 300 patients with hurricane-related injuries. A small fleet of fishing boats from the North End were lost, as were many of the men on them. And so just to give you a sense, as I said, I was learning about the impact on historic New England's properties. 2 properties I mentioned here very briefly. This one is the Codman Estate, and it had massive landscape damage. At the Codman Estate, there were elms on this acreage that had been planted by grandfather John Codman in the late 18th century, and they were treasured by later generations, truly. They came crashing down. The Lymans, they had a family country retreat in Waltham, Massachusetts, and this was a family, much like the Codmans, that took a strong interest in horticulture and agriculture. They picked out all of their trees and all of their plantings very carefully, and you can see the devastation that this hurricane had on that retreat. It clearly took many, many weeks, if not months, for workers to clear up these amount of trees. And so while the damage to both estates could have been a lot worse, generations of Codmans and Lymans lived on these properties, and each family took it very hard when a part of their ancestral home was destroyed. In central and western Massachusetts, massive flooding, mostly due to the overflowing rivers I mentioned, that became a huge problem. So again, factories were shut down, hitting already struggling areas very hard. Roads sunk in, bridges were wiped out, food had to be airdropped in. Sections of Chicopee were evacuated due to the rising waters of the Connecticut River. The high-tension towers of the Turners Falls Power and Electric Company in East Hampton were knocked down during the hurricane's high winds. This caused much of a blackout in western Massachusetts. The storm isolated towns in the Berkshires for days. Ware, Massachusetts was cut off for 5 days. Much like Connecticut towns in the Connecticut River Valley, crops and livestock were almost a total loss. 3,000 trees in Amherst came down. The dam in East Lee burst, leading to water gushing through the main street, wiping out buildings in its path. 50 families had to be rescued from their homes by boat. The Quinebaug River rose 14 feet above normal, causing all roads in Southbridge to be submerged in impassable. And so New Hampshire, as I'm sure many of you know, also had significant flooding and wind damage. In Peterborough, a major fire, caused by water, of course, burned down 4 city blocks. Here is a spot on Lake Winnipesaukee before the hurricane, and here is that same spot after. The storm finally began to weaken as it began to pass over southwestern New Hampshire. By 9 p.m., the storm reached Burlington, Vermont. And while there was flood damage, it was far less powerful. It would continue to Quebec and Montreal, and then completely peter out on September 22nd. Clearly, though, towns throughout New England continued to battle the elements for days and weeks to come. In upstate Connecticut, the Connecticut River did not start retreating until Friday, so that's 2 days after the storm. Downtown Providence flooded again on Thursday, as firemen began pumping out water from buildings. So most estimates are that between 600 to 700 people died because of the hurricane of 1938. And again, about half of those fatalities happened in Rhode Island. Maine was the only New England state with no fatality. 1,750 people were seriously injured. And remember, this is happening while the country is still struggling with the Great Depression. 93,000 families suffered serious property damage. 63,000 were left homeless. Only 5% of property loss was covered by insurance. Thousands of livestock were killed. In Connecticut, tobacco production dropped from 15,000 acres to 5. The remaining textile industry moved for good to the south. The fishing industry was devastated as well. In southern New England, 88% of the population lost power, and a quarter of all telephone service was knocked out, and about 175 churches were damaged. Half of all New Hampshire white pine was wiped out. In Rhode Island, the hurricane ended the state's lumber industry. At the Lawrence Farm in Brookline, Massachusetts, 200 trees were lost. Building lumber and firewood were salvaged from those trees. That wood lasted until 1980. The U.S. Forest Service estimated that enough lumber was felled to build 200,000 five-room homes. Around New England, pieces popped up that were created from the hurricane of 1938. So we have 2 different examples here. Here to the left, you see is a chair that was made in Gardner, Massachusetts, and underneath the seat of that chair is a note saying that it was from wood that was felled from the hurricane of 1938. The room to the right is from a building in northeastern Massachusetts, and that was constructed from hurricane of 1938 pine. Now, I, of course, would never mean to put the loss of these trees on the same level of the loss of lives, but I mention this to show you how the very look and feel of towns that had been around for centuries changed, even in the places, like you would say here in New Hampshire, that did not bear the full brunt of this storm. Trees that had once lined main streets and commons were wiped out. And if you think about it, elements that were typically New England, fishing boats, waterfront areas, trees and town commons, many of these trees had existed since the Pilgrims arrived, church steeples, they were gone, sometimes without a trace. New maps had to be drawn of the coast. Beaches were enlarged, inlets were created. The storm fashioned truly a new coastline. New England would never be the same. James Spicer, vice chairman of the Red Cross, stated during a visit to South County, "I have never seen a hurricane more complete in its devastation. I cannot recall any instances where whole communities were blown away and left a pile of splintered wreckage more than a mile from their original sites." Now, it really was the New Deal that made recovery possible. 2 days after the hurricane hit, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, began hiring all available men off of relief rolls. 11,000 civilian conservation corps workers cleared the streets and helped flooded areas. The National Youth Administration worked on cleanup projects as well. Reconstruction Finance Corp lent money to affected businesses. Federal Power Commission sent engineers to help restore power. Federal surplus commodities provided food and supplies. Federal Writers Project created a pictorial history of this disaster. And with all the downed trees, there was a huge risk of the market being flooded with timber. the New England Forest Emergency Project, and the Northeast Timber Salvage Corps, 2 more government agencies, created sawmills that could salvage the lumber, paid workers to clear the debris, and created nurseries to help nourish back new forests. They also bought lumber at above market prices, helping to avert a timber crisis. The hurricane demonstrated a change in both local and national politics. It showed that the government exists not just to protect rights, but to help people in their greatest hour of need. Unlike in previous catastrophes, New England and Long Island were rebuilt thanks to the federal government, not private citizens and organizations. In addition, thankfully, changes did take place at the National Weather Bureau. Following the hurricane, it continued to insist that it was blameless in the tragedy, telling the public that those in the Northeast wouldn't even believe them if they were told that a hurricane was coming their way. While there were certainly major issues in the way the National Weather Bureau was managed, really, the fact was the hurricane moved too fast to be tracked accurately by forecasters with the tools that they had available at that time. But a shakeup did soon occur. A Navy commander was appointed chief, a meteorologist from MIT was appointed assistant chief, and an order was given to start a research and training program. Now today, with the recon aircraft, radars, satellites, and a much better understanding of weather patterns, there really is little chance that a hurricane of this magnitude could hit an entire region with no warning. Yet with that being said, I think as many of us know, hurricanes are notoriously hard to predict. Even today, the day before a hurricane hits landfall, there can be a 100-mile error in hurricane path predictions. And so I mentioned at the beginning that this would become the hurricane that all others in New England would be measured up against. So how does the hurricane of '38 measure up to our more recent storms? Now you can see with the chart to the left, it was not one of the top 10 costliest hurricanes to hit the U.S. The top 3, according to the National Hurricane Center, are Hurricanes Katrina, Sandy, and Andrew. And you'll notice that they all occurred in the past 20 plus years. Now because of a rising population, standard of living, and city growth, a hurricane of the same force hitting the same exact area would be more costly today than 76 years ago. So taking that into consideration, the National Hurricane Center also ranks the costliest hurricanes, adjusting for inflation, housing, and population. And so when they do that adjustment, you'll see that the hurricane of 1938 does rank on the list as the 7th, with damages of around $41.1 billion. And that's, of course, in today's dollars. If you compare the '38 hurricane with the more recent hurricane, Sandy, happened just a couple of years ago, you'll see that they're very close in damage costs, only about $9 million apart. And you might have noticed, I certainly did, during Hurricane Sandy and right after, a lot of people in this area were describing, comparing that hurricane with the hurricane of 1938. And there's definitely some good reason why. Both the storms hit at a high tide and a full moon, which is why storm surges caused such a large amount of damage in both cases. But you know, with the hurricane of 1938, there was much stronger winds. It was a Category 3 when it hit land, as compared to Hurricane Sandy's Category 1. And so it's amazing to see the amount of damage Hurricane Sandy caused with those less powerful winds. It gives you, I think, just a sense of what the hurricane of '38 could do today with that strength. And luckily, of course, no other New England hurricane since has killed or injured as many people. And I think it's the staggering amount of casualties, as well as the lethal element of surprise, that means that it's unlikely that any other hurricane will really be able to be compared with this storm. The hurricane of 1938 is truly a New England story, not only because it happened here, but because it really did not get much coverage in other parts of the country. Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia overshadowed the disaster the next day in newspapers and radio. A person stranded on a train in Worcester during the actual storm itself later said of the long hours on the train, "We did miss having a radio. Most of us were wondering how the Czechs were making out." It struck me as a little funny. It sandwiched between the Great Depression and World War II and never hit the national level as the Chicago fire or the San Francisco earthquake, even though the Great Hurricane caused more death than those 2 other disasters combined. Looking back on it, one could say that the hurricane marked the end of a point in time. As one author put it, Although few if any realized it at the time, 1938 would be the last of the old New England summers, the Yankee establishment had been giving away slowly. A sea of newness was washing over it. A New Deal, a Square Deal, a social compact. The political and social changing of the guard. The pace of life began to quicken. To those who lived to tell the tale more than any other single event, the hurricane marked the beginning of modern times. What nature's storm began, the storms of war would complete. And a gracious, circumscribed way of life was lost
It always does that.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if anyone have any questions or some thoughts, if they recollect anything from that happened around here.
That's right. If anyone has memories of stories they've heard or what they experienced around this area, I'd love to hear it as well. As you can see, New Hampshire really isn't the focal point of this presentation. Yeah.
I lived in Providence,
Oh my goodness.
and I was in high school. And you mentioned at the beginning of how quiet everything was. I felt really eerie when I was walking home from school. And both my sister and my mother were working. It was Depression time.
Right.
And we lived in a 3-decker house. And I was all alone in the house. And I could feel the house swaying. And the skylight blew off the house.
Oh my gosh.
And I just remember that they had the National Guard out and the flooding in downtown Providence.
Oh my gosh.
And now, in this day and age, one of my nieces lives in Narragansett, and the other one lives in Westport.
Oh my goodness. So right in major areas. I know. It's scary to think that it could. It certainly is. Thank you for sharing. That is incredible. Does anyone else have any questions?
Would you like to see a picture?
I would love to see a picture.
163 miles an hour on top of Mount Washington.
Was it during the hurricane?
That day.
Oh my gosh. Oh. Of course. Oh my gosh. And you see pictures like this throughout New England, you know, even in towns that didn't bear the brunt, we're still completely altered. Oh my goodness.
Okay.
Was everyone okay in your family? Oh my gosh. Lucky that's all that happened, but still.